A quick preamble today before the podcast. I want you to know that I've partnered with a company called Roundtable to create a unique space dedicated to genetics and history enthusiasts. Our exclusive space is going to be organized into small, intimate roundtables of 4 to 6 people to ensure deep discussions and personal engagement. Every week, I'll provide an agenda for these discussions, and twice a month, I'll host an AMA for all members. If this opportunity excites you, feel free to apply at the link below in the show notes or www.roundtable.sh/hubs, HUBS, /Razib Khan. Again, www.roundtable.sh/hubs /Razib Khan, or at the link in the show notes. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
10% of pediatric cancer is linked to a single gene variation. These variants can be detected in embryos before pregnancy begins. Orkin's whole genome reports can help mitigate your child's risk for cancer by screening for 90-plus genetic variants linked to pediatric cancer. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert. Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast, and I have a return guest. Sometimes return guest is like a year ago. This return guest is from a really long time ago. One of the first guests on my Substack podcast on unsupervised learning. So I think I talked to Eric, Dr. Eric Cline of George Washington University, author of 1177, The Year Civilization Collapsed, 1177 BC, not AD. So I talked to Eric, I think fall of 2020. This was kind of in the midst of the pandemic, a very different time than now, obviously. So it's been a while. I'm not going to say how many years because we're that many years older. But, there has been some new discoveries. Well, I wasn't going to talk about this, not in the notes, but you know what? Like, this is my show. I can do whatever I want to, even in, but in the field of ancient history, Eric is obviously focused on the Bronze Age, which we will talk about extensively. But the recent scrolls that were deciphered with AI, the initial batch of discoveries just came out, and people are very excited about that. And I am very excited about that and what we might know about, maybe what Eric would call the Iron Age, the Roman period. But it just goes to show technology, physical science, operating with synthesis with the historical sciences. Anyone who's listened to this show, read my Substack, knows what ancient DNA has done to prehistory and archaeology. Also other things like isotope analysis, analysis of, bones of ancient people. There's just so much information that we're getting about the past and that are, explaining, illuminating, refuting, verifying. It's an exciting time to be alive. I think I said something like this actually the last time that I talked to Eric, but it's really even like over the last 4 years, it's gotten even crazier. And so, we're on the precipice of some great discoveries. Those of us that were reading, I don't know, like Jacquetta Hawks or something when we were kids, I think this is a really great time to be alive because a lot of the things that we were wondering about, I think will be resolved. The great debates will come closer to resolution. Now, full resolution never happens in these sorts of sciences, in these sorts of scholarly endeavors. But, if we get 95% of the way there, I think that's sufficient for government work, as they say. So with that preamble, Eric, it's been a while. You have a new book out, which we will talk about extensively. After 1177 BC, the survival of civilizations, which I think you can say in a way is a pretty straightforward sequel to your previous book. But you had the earlier book, which as we're recording right now, you mentioned it's been about a decade. Now, the earlier book is not an obscure book. I'm going to just say it became something of a cultural phenomenon. I read it. Anyone who knows me would probably know I would read it. But there's a lot of other people who bought the book. I don't think it's in like the Piketty range of how many people bought the book and didn't read the book, but you have a proportion of people that bought the book and is now on their coffee table. So the book is known even outside from people that read it front to back, which, this is like a weird compliment, but it's a book that people felt like they had to read. It came out at a particular time in our culture in the 21st century where we were concerned about anthropogenic climate change and whatnot. And I think 1177, like say Kyle Harper's Fate of Rome, is one of those new works of history that really integrates an understanding of things like paleoclimate, paleo-environmental conditions. It's not just the recitation of events from linear B, or accounting from linear B tablets and whatnot, right? So it became a cultural phenomenon. It became talked of. I saw people talk about 1177, tweet about it, mention it in conversation. Although, it's one of those things where it's like people would like get the date wrong, like 72 or 1117. I'm like, I think you mean 1177. I remember specifically saying that. So, tell me actually what this has been like for you as an academic. And also, you've been on my friend Patrick Wyman's podcast. You put yourself out there. It's not just the book, but, it's kind of in reaction to, I think, the phenomenon that the book became. And so a decade out, like, tell me about that as an academic and how you feel. I'm assuming reception's been pretty positive, how that's affected your research going forward, your communication going forward and whatnot.
Well, to begin with, thank you for having me back on your show. It's a delight to be here. And just to comment on everything that you opened with, this is a very exciting time to be alive, and especially to be an archaeologist. This is a period that colleagues of mine are calling the third wave in archaeology, which is where we're using exact life sciences, as Israel Finkelstein would call it, where we're using ancient DNA, like you say, where we're using techniques to try and decipher ancient climate change. We're using the sciences now, which is what has allowed my work to go forward, but also everyone else's. So we're making huge advances now. And indeed, you referred to the reading of the scrolls from Herculaneum that have been announced. And to use AI to read carbonized scrolls from 79 AD is absolutely amazing. It's really exciting to think that we could maybe reconstruct an entire lost library. It's not lost, it's carbonized, but now we'll be able to read it. So anyway, that's where my original book, the 1177 BC, came from, was that I had been asked by Rob Tempio of Princeton University Press to write a book about the collapse of the late Bronze Age. And I had said, well, it's been done before. In fact, Princeton had published a book 20 years earlier by Robert Drews, which was very good. And Rob Tempio said, well, haven't things changed in the interim? And I said, yes. He said, well, then go ahead and write a new edition with, all this new data. So 2014, the book came out. And as you say, not overnight, but slowly and surely it caught on among the general public. And even eventually, I don't know if it was me or not, but some of the things became memes. You saw suddenly tweets and memes about the Bronze Age and the Sea Peoples. And, again, I don't know if that was me or not, but it was, as an academic, it was incredibly rewarding because my main aim in writing the book was to bring knowledge of the late Bronze Age and of the collapse to the general public. I mean, a lot of people, most people have heard about the fall of the Roman Empire, but almost nobody outside of academia had heard of the collapse of the late Bronze Age. So I'm absolutely thrilled that this information is making it out to the general public. Now, what happened was, and again, don't quite know why, but after my book came out in 2014, just a whole slew of new data came out. Climate change, ancient DNA, just tons, and including publications of tablets from sites like Ugarit that hadn't been previously published. And for example, some of them came out in 2016 in French, and then were translated into English by a friend of mine, Yuri Cohen, in 2021. So, and I had some advanced knowledge of that. So I had asked the press if I could put out a revised edition. And that's what came out in 2021 with lots of new data, such that I changed my conclusion slightly, where I decided that climate change, not to jump on, the proverbial bandwagon, but there was more evidence for a drought and famine, not just scientifically, but from written texts for back then. And so I decided that of all the possible factors, and I had argued for a perfect storm of factors that all coalesced to create the collapse. If I had to rank them now, I would rank climate change, the drought, as the number one stressor, with the others then falling in line after that. So my thoughts did change a bit, but everything supported what I had said originally, which for me was nice vindication. And so at that point, I also became interested in what happens after collapse. What do you do if your society is collapsed? Are you resilient? Do you transform or whatever? And so we decided that it made sense to have a sequel and look at the next 400 years, what happened after the collapse. And that's where the sequel comes in. And it's literally called After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilizations, though I will say that not all of them survive.
Yeah, it is not like a movie. I think we know which ones. I'm gonna spoil it. Listener, the Hittites do not survive. So I'm gonna spoil the movie for you. In any case, so yeah, I think this is a natural book. This is a topic. This is more of an archaeological topic, from what I know historically more, although you do have actually a fair amount of narrative in here. You have a fair amount of text in your book. And so this is what some people have called the Dark Age, a Dark Age. And you have a discussion about what that means, because you call it a Dark Age. One thing that I'll say, I got in like a little bit of trouble online here about this, but and I'm going to get your reaction, since you are the archaeologist. I think I said something to the effect of the cultural civilization, and I might have said it a little different after reading your book, to be candid, but let's just say what I said. The cultural and civilizational collapses of earlier periods were very extreme compared to what happened later. Where the discontinuities tended to be less and less notable. So, for example, as you note in your book, and we already knew this, the Greeks maintained a ethno-linguistic and demographic. Actually, we do know this now from the DNA, since your book was originally published, in 2014, and demographic continuity between the Mycenaean Bronze Age, the palatial civilizations, and the classical period, the Polis period, right? So, okay, it ends at around 1200, and then it starts to kind of show up again around 800, really 600, but let's just put 800, right? So there's a 4th-century break, and the stylized fact is, well, they thought that the palaces were created by Cyclops, which, really one ancient, observer, but whatever. Like, they didn't remember that this was their own ancestors making 4 centuries earlier. And, up until the 20th century, until Michael Ventris translated Linear B, people thought that this was a pre-Greek civilization and society, partly just because of the archaeology and the prehistory. What we find is with Linear B, the language is basically a dialect. It's a form of ancient Greek. and it's readable, I think, by historians, obviously, and also now we know genetically they're basically the big difference between modern Greeks and these Bronze Age Greeks is modern Greeks seem to have substantially more Northern European ancestry, which Slavic ancestry, which is a little bit weird for some of the theories that Northern European archaeologists were promoting in the 19th century. It's kind of inverted. But in any case, like setting that aside, so we know that, right? And what I said was, there were these like big breaks and people kind of lost their cultural memory. Whereas like even after the fall of Rome, obviously there was a big break. I mean, I agree with Brian Ward Perkins and others that the collapse is a real thing in the Western Empire, but the memory of the Roman Empire, Latin, Christianity, all of these things, the cultural memory preserved. And then like later on, you have things like the Little Ice Age, which obviously made a huge difference in the world. And there's books about how that changed civilization. But really, early modern Europe is a direct, continuous, unbroken, in my opinion, barring the technological innovations, which there are many, of late, Renaissance, late medieval Europe, right? So as like you have these exogenous shocks, and in the earlier periods, the shocks have a much bigger impact. I think there's some theoretical reasons for that in terms of just our cultural toolkit and whatnot. But further you go back, my hypothesis is the more these exogenous shocks basically cause disruptions and breaks. So we know before the late Bronze Age one, there's some sort of exogenous shock around 4,100 years ago or so. And that was the end of, like Third Dynasty of Ur. That was when the Indus Valley civilization really kind of went into lower gear and kind of faded out. And then there was some weird stuff that happened in China, which we're not like totally clear about, but a reorganization there. And then we now know, since I've last talked to you, like I've done a lot more reading candidly about the archaeology of Europe, say 5,000 years ago, something really happened to kind of really knock out the Bronze Age, or not the Bronze Age, the Neolithic farming societies across the continent. There's exogenous shock. I think the world got colder and wetter, if I remember correctly, at least that part of the world. And then also, I'm going to put this out there because I know Christian Christiansen will probably be listening. He wants me to emphasize like there's a lot of evidence now that actually the disease, Eurasian disease, was having an effect. So these are all what scientists would call, these are like abiotic and biotic effects, but they're exogenous. And so anyway, it's a long way of saying that I think that these environmental impacts had a much bigger cultural and, you as an archaeologist, material impact in terms of explaining the changes 3, 4, 5,000 years ago than today. And the last thing that I will say, and I do want your take on this, it's not about 1177, but I said that I would not be shocked if a more extreme form of this did occur, perhaps after the last glacial maximum, but before the Holocene, where there was a complex forager society that produced, say like Göbekli Tepe, but similar or a little better, and that totally was wiped away by an environmental catastrophe. Which again, I'm not trying to be Grant Hancock here, but I think that there is a little room that we have now for I would say catastrophism, just because it seems like human culture, quote unquote civilization, although I think that that's like a tendentious word, was much more fragile in the past before the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, really the last 2,000 years. And this is, I'm going off of William McNeil's ideas in the human web and whatnot from 30 years ago, his last real book. But anyway, I've been going on a while. Let me get your take, you as an archaeologist, as a historian, someone who's an academic in the field, of my amateur musings.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground right there. There's a lot to unpack right there. So let me see if I can start in on some of it. First and foremost, what occurred to me as you were talking, two things. One, archaeologists, ancient historians, academics in general are quite divided on the idea of collapse at at one point I said, and I still say, that every society or civilization in history has collapsed, and it would be hubristic of us to think that we won't collapse as well. But then, on the other hand, there are people that say no society has ever collapsed. I'm like, wait, what do you mean? They're like, well, they don't collapse, they transform, or they become something new. And I'm like, oh, so now we're into semantics. And I still say that societies have collapsed because, as you said, spoiler alert, there's no more Hittites after the late Bronze Age collapse. And in Greece, despite what you said, there's also no more Mycenaeans. There are no more Minoans. That is to say, nobody that self-identifies that way in the society. Certainly, the people do continue, though in Greece, there was probably somewhere between 40 and 60% death and or migration at this time. But you're right, the basic DNA keeps going. We do have continuity throughout this, so that we see in the Linear B tablets, as you mentioned, which is indeed a form of early Greek, they mention the Greek gods and goddesses, Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and such. So we can see that things do make it over the transition, shall we say. The people that do the Bronze Age versus people that study the Iron Age, which is what I prefer to call this first Dark Age. I would argue it's better to call it the Iron Age, that there is some continuity. I look at it kind of as a permeable membrane where some things get through and others do not. But so we do have transformation to a certain extent. But that's what this book is all about. I go geographically rather than chronologically. And it really is, as I say in the author's note at the end, I say, folks, this is a history book. It's a history book with some archaeology thrown in. And what we're gonna talk about is the history of these next 4 centuries in Assyria, Babylonia, Cyprus, Egypt, Greece, Anatolia, and so on. And we have a lot of information, not just archaeological, but historical. We have tons of inscriptions. We've got, as I say at one point, almost too much information. So I go on some really deep dives, and I suspect I may lose some readers along the way with all of the names and places. So I put a dramatis personae at the end. But I would ask people to just make it through, because at the end, the last chapter, are my analyses, which I think are going to generate some debate. But to pick up as one final point, what you were saying, climate change and things like the 4.2 KYA, the climate change at the end of the 3rd millennium. We've also got this climate change at the end of the 2nd millennium. And one of the things that I like that I actually added into the revised edition of the initial book was this concept of RCCs, rapid climate changes, which have happened about every 1,500 years, give or take. And there are, I think, no fewer than 6 that have been noted during the Holocene, and most of them are linked to major changes like the Neolithic Revolution. So I'm personally unsure and am not willing to go as far as saying there may have been some advanced forager society that disappeared. I don't see any archaeological evidence for that, but that's not to say that somebody won't find it next week. You know, we're always finding things in archaeology. But if we go from the known, we know that from the Neolithic on, there have been these rapid climate changes and so-called bond events, which can be tied to things like the collapse of the late Bronze Age and even things associated with the fall of the Roman Empire. So this is also where I think science is coming in and is helping us to look at all of this. So, but again, I don't think I've touched on all of your points, but
No, a lot there. Yeah.
yes.
Well, I mean, I will say so. Let's talk about 11. Let's talk about the new book. New book. I'll just say new book. Because it has 1177 as well, or after 1177. The Book of Iron, the Iron Age book. Which I will say. So quick impression for the listener and hopefully reader. Get the book. It's at fine bookstores out there. It's a great book. So I guess like two surprises. One, I wasn't super surprised by. The second, I was a little surprised by, and I'm just gonna put this out there for people. The first thing is, there wasn't a massive amount of information in the book about the transition from bronze to iron. It seemed like it was more of a, I don't want to say gradual, but maybe like piecemeal, stepwise transition, as opposed to, and you know what? Like, let's after I speak my piece, like address the Dorian invasion, bringing iron and overthrowing the citadels, which is something that some listeners, older listeners, will know about, something they've read about. But so that was one thing that was underemphasized, I would say, or so maybe it's not a thing, maybe it's overdone, and we can talk about that. The other issue is, yeah, you clearly do have written text, so I was expecting more a work of archaeology, where I would see like okay, I'm not gonna lie, like I just get really bored when I see a grid plan of some ancient housing complex. You know what I'm saying? You guys out there know what I'm saying. When you read like an archaeology book and there's a grid plan and it's like an outline of a hut and then it shows where all the other huts are and here's where you found the pan, and I'm like, I don't care. But so there was a lot less of that than I was maybe fearing. There's a lot more narrative. So, for example, you really went into the detail of Egypt, and we can talk about that later after you talk about the Dorians. But there's obviously a fair amount of text material, and I actually take your point, and that's feedback that I gave, where there's like a lot of narrative and names in there. It's not as bad as Carthage, where there's like 27 Hannibals, and you don't know who they are, But sometimes the names are like, oh, wait a second, because they're not the most like they don't roll off the tongue. Let's put it that way. There's been enough cultural discontinuity that these are names that are no longer used. And like some of the Hittite names, which like the Hittites themselves did not figure too. I mean, the Neo-Hittites did, which I think a lot of listeners will know who they are from the Bible, the Neo-Hittites of Syria. But the Hittites proper did not figure too much, I think partly because they had pretty much like been wiped off the map by most of the narrative. But so you have a lot of narrative, a lot of text. So there was a lot more text from this period. So if you think Dark Age, okay, well, so writing literacy basically disappeared from Greece, but you clearly have a lot of sources from the Near East, and you've used those sources to tell the narrative. So first, like, let's go to you have a long section which I would say debunks the Dorian invasion, which I knew about. I knew that it was debunked, but I think it's also related to the transition to iron. Maybe bringing Cyprus. It's a lot more complicated. It's not like so complicated you can't track it, but it really, really, the simple narrative does not seem to hold. And there's a somewhat more complicated narrative that fits the facts better. And so get into that. And then let's talk about Egypt and its whimper out of relevancy.
Okay, thanks. Yes, you're quite right. I agree with you phrased it well there. Let's see. Let's start with the Dorians. It's a myth. There's no invasion. I actually dismiss it pretty much right away. Observant readers will notice that at the beginning of 1177 BC, I start with the Sea Peoples, and at the beginning of after 1177 BC, I begin with the Dorians. And yes, I was deliberately trying to make a parallel structure there. And spoiler alert: the first part of the prologue, I describe the Dorian invasions, them coming in with their weapons of iron and invading Greece and all of that. And after 2 or 3 paragraphs of vivid description, I then have a 1-sentence paragraph that simply reads, "But it probably never happened." And in fact, archaeologically, there is no evidence for a so-called Dorian invasion. But, this is not news to the archaeologist. We have known this for decades. What it has not done is gotten into the public conscience. And so that is one of the kind of crusades that I'm on with this new book, is to get people to realize that there was no Dorian invasion. So I actually, and this just occurred to me, I can foresee a whole number of new memes coming out of this but the Dorian invasion, it never happened, or something like that, or comparing sea peoples to Dorian invasion. What's important, though, is that people used to say one of two things: that either the sea peoples were able to defeat all these Bronze Age civilizations because they had weapons of iron. That's simply not true, and I dismiss that in this book. They had bronze like everybody else. But you also see that the Dorians came in, and they were able to win because they had weapons of iron. And that also is simply not true. In fact, what happens, as you said, it's a bit more of a transition. There's no sudden break between using bronze for weapons and tools and iron. It does seem to be fairly gradual, and bear in mind that they are already using some iron towards the end of the Bronze Age, but not so much. They really didn't turn to iron until they had to. But this is also where there's something that I do in the book. I say right up front that I want to show the reader where all of our information comes from, in the interest of transparency. So if I say something, you are not then saying, well, how do you know that? So in most cases, and this is certainly the case with iron, which comes up mostly in the chapter on Cyprus, I say, look, let me walk you through the arguments. Some people say this, some people say that. And I realize some readers will say, just tell me the answer. And my answer, or my rebuttal to that, is there is no 100% right answer. This is what our current thinking is. So, for instance, we used to think that they changed to iron because the supplies of tin were cut off at the end of the late Bronze Age. And even copper became less available. Now we're not so sure about that. It does look they still were able to get some tin. Copper is still available, but they do change to iron for whatever reason. And in fact, it's the people, we think, on Cyprus that are the first to start transitioning to this new technology, because making iron is quite different from making bronze. But the bronze makers on Cyprus, since that's where most of the copper had come from, they would have learned about iron in the process, almost a byproduct. And so it looks like the first items that are made in iron, they're actually bimetallic. They're iron daggers with bronze, like bronze hilts, basically. And they make them on Cyprus and then export them in both directions, to Greece on the one side and to Levant on the other. But they are not keeping this a secret. They are exporting the know-how, the technique, along with the items. So now we think that it may be the Cypriots that are at the forefront of this, which contradicts what people used to think. We used to think it was the Hittites. We used to think it was, all these people. But now archaeology, bit by bit by bit, is changing the narrative. And as you mentioned, what I tried to do in this book, despite the names and places and all of that, I tried to make it a narrative. But it is much more messy than the end of the Bronze Age. This is a messier story. In fact, it's not one story. It is quite literally 8 different stories of what to do and what not to do if you collapse. So I compare it to a kaleidoscope where you've got all the pieces and they sometimes come together to form a picture and sometimes not. So with all the text, sometimes we have incredibly detailed information, but at other times we've got almost none. for instance, there's a period of about 75 years right after the late Bronze Age collapse in Assyria, modern day Iraq, where we don't have any text at all. We've got nothing written left to us for 75 years. So there are big gaps in our knowledge. And I do, again, at the beginning of the book say, look, there are going to be some very deep dives in places and others not deep at all. And unfortunately, for the most part, we know information about the top elites, the 1%. We don't know so much about the underlying classes because they didn't leave the records. We don't know that much about them, except maybe where archaeology can tell us a lot about it. So there is a lot to unpack here. And as I say, it is messier, but I think it's fascinating. And one of the things that I end the book with is, as you've alluded to, I don't think this is a period that is rightfully called a dark age. When you have, as my colleagues have pointed out, and by the way, nothing I'm saying in this book is going to be news to my colleagues. They're like, yeah, we know this. But it is news to the general public. And again, that is my aim, just like with the first book. The second book, this is the period, these are the periods I love. Oh my God, these are the most interesting periods in ancient history for me. And I want to kind of share my enthusiasm with everyone else. So I'm not saying anything new. I'm just relating the discussions and the discoveries. But in the end, any period that sees not only the invention of iron, but also the standardization of the alphabet, which we haven't gotten to yet. But this period sees both of those. That's not what happens in a dark age. So archaeologists call this period the Iron Age. And at the end of the book, I make a plea for abandoning calling this a dark age and just saying, let's just call it the Iron Age, which is what it is.
All right. So a couple of things here. I want to jump to Egypt, and then obviously, when you talk about alphabets and all those things, that's an interesting cultural artifact. Iron versus bronze. For those of us who are not archaeologists, is it true? Are the things that we read as kids about iron being sharper, tougher, cheaper, are those things all true? Or was it kind of like they got better and better at figuring out how to forge iron? So the initial, the gap was smaller originally. I don't know. Give us a sense.
No, I think you're right. It is better. It is just better. It's more difficult to make in some ways until you figure out how to do it. And then once you've got the process down, it's not terrible. But in terms of making bronze versus making making bronze is easier. But iron, sharper, better, holds an edge, et cetera, et cetera. I would definitely go with iron over bronze that way. But, there was a period of experimentation, and then they were off and running, shall we say.
Yeah, I do have to say, reading those, a little bit, those sections, I had to step back and reflect on how amazing it is that these monkeys figured out how to melt metal and reshape it into tools. We take things for granted, but maybe we shouldn't. I want to talk about Egypt. Your narrative, really the narrative richness begins, I think, in your work with Egypt in terms of a conventional history, because we have records, or we have copies of records, copies of copies of copies, but whatever, Egypt is dry. They've been writing things, and, some of these papyri and other things, obviously they're hieroglyphs, but, there are also things that are preserved for a long time. So, we have a good chronology. We have all the kings from the late Ptolemaic period. They had records from the previous period. I've read some histories of Egypt. Obviously when I was a kid, everyone reads histories of Egypt from there. Well, everyone in the listenership, I think, has read histories of Egypt when they were a kid. That's a thing you do, like you read about dinosaurs. Okay. And then as an adult, I read some histories, and I was always struck by, Egypt's shocking, to me, cultural continuity, say from the Old Kingdom, even down into the Persian period, where or down into even the Ptolemaic period, because ultimately they were the same Egyptians with kind of the same gods. They changed over time, but basically the same people. Some of these temples were around for thousands of years, I think. I mean, there might have been a ship of Theseus effect where, you renovate, and so it might have been like changed a lot from the original temple 2200 BC or whatever. But, there are temples during the Libyan period that go back way, way, into the, Middle Kingdom or whatever, right? And so there's a lot of continuity. I think it shows in your book where some of the names are, okay, like those are Egyptian names. They're doing Egyptian things like messing around in Israel, Palestine, which has actually substantial. It's well timed. Let's put it that way. So you know what, Eric? You are definitely you are definitely charmed in some ways with your timing. Of your book. There's good hooks, which you don't need a hook for me, but for like people with the coffee table set, like definitely you got some good hooks in here. So let's talk about Egypt, and I think Egypt is a strong case. I think along with Mesopotamia, actually like a lot of your examples, that there wasn't I think our narrative are, as in the public, the interested public, not academics and not the football watching public, for example. I know a lot of you guys watch football. I'm just like average person. The narrative is dominated by Greece. Greece exhibits, even if there wasn't an ethno-linguistic rupture, a kind of like cultural memory rupture. Whereas that did not happen in Egypt. Egypt seemed to just survive and limp along, and kind of Egypt was a little bit like, I'm going to say something controversial, which I want to do. Egypt was a little bit like Britain today. it was a great empire, and now it's like, what's going on here? But Britain today would be recognizable to British people 100 years ago, just comparatively shabbier. So talk about what happened in Egypt. Start the story. Basically it's like where the story left off. The Sea Peoples got defeated, and Egypt is still left standing, but hobbled. And so talk about that.
Sure. And in fact, I start the book, chapter 1, with the same story that I ended the last book, namely the assassination of Ramses III, right? This great guy who had beaten the Sea Peoples in 1177 ends up being assassinated in a tawdry harem conspiracy by one of his own lesser wives, who had a son that she wanted to succeed him. So he was murdered, he was assassinated. So it was kind of a nasty end to a pretty good career. But Ramses III, he's not the last guy with that name. We actually go all the way through Ramses the 11th, right? And it continues. We're into the 19th, the 20th dynasties. But then, as you mentioned, things go a little bit south for Egypt. Now, so in terms of Egypt, what I would say, if I were ranking all these societies, they rank right in the middle. They're better than the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, but they're not as good as the Phoenicians or Cypriots or Assyrians. In fact, I have a table in the last chapter of the book where I do rank them, and Egypt is ranked in the third category out of 5. Number 1 is more than simply resilient, perhaps even anti-fragile, that is flourishing in the age of chaos, which is something that Nassim Nicholas Taleb has talked about. Number 2 is very resilient. Number 3, where Egypt is resilient, but just barely. They're coping, but they're not adapting. So what I actually do is use the IPCC definitions, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won a Nobel Prize back in 2007. I use their definitions for coping, adapting, transforming, and I try to apply it to these ancient societies. So I would say Egypt is right in the middle. They didn't do terribly, but they didn't do wonderfally. They did survive, but they're not the power that they were back in the New Kingdom, not in the time of, King Tut and such. But that's not to say they didn't have some amazing people. I mean, this is the period when Sheshonq I, the Libyan founder of Dynasty 22, he's up and running, may even have come up to the land of Canaan, which by that time Solomon would have just died. You've got the kingdoms of Israel and Judah just starting, and Sheshonq claims that he went up and campaigned and in fact captured sites like Megiddo. There's like 120, 130 sites that he says he captured, and he might be Shishak in the Bible. So, Egypt is still there, but they're not like they were. They're racked by internal problems, and that is one of the things that we see after collapse in how the different societies adapt or not.
Yeah, I mean, Egypt clearly, throughout its whole ancient period, I mean, even into the modern period, although obviously, Arabization and Islamization was a big cultural rupture, but I mean, yeah, they forgot how to read hieroglyphs and whatnot, but they remembered who they were. They're in the Bible, in the Quran, in whatever, they're mentioned. They're obviously mentioned by the Greeks. So Egypt, like the memory of what Egypt was, unlike say the Mycenaeans, which is a much more vague, fuzzy recollection. I mean, there are fragments that are remembered, the boar's tusks and whatnot. You've written books about what is true and what is not true in the Iliad, and you get a little bit into that, but not, it's not a primary focus. But so yeah, Egypt is kind of like, I would say it's one of those things like how the mighty have fallen, like the Shelley poem. And actually, like what you're talking about is the transition from Egypt's greatest maximal imperial phase, when it really busted out of the Nile River Valley and became a power, up into what is now, contemporaneously like Aleppo, northern Syria, where all of those, what we know from, 5 years ago, a lot of battles, a lot of fighting, where ISIS, the Syrian government, and the other rebels are all coming together. That, during the Bronze Age, like stuff was going down there too, between the Hittites, the Egyptians, and the Mitanni. And so that is kind of like the setting, or the starting point to like 1 to 2 centuries later. Egypt's basically just trying to like stay on its, get off its knees. Mm-hmm. It did get off its knees, but it never really recaptured that spirit. But it remembered that spirit. So you said Sheshonq. There's actually a fair amount in here, which I was surprised by. Maybe I shouldn't have been, about Israel, Palestine. I'm just gonna say Palestine, whatever that area. It's not Palestine yet because the Philistines didn't give it its name. But we don't want to get into like obviously the semantic morass. But let's just say like Canaan, that area. And you mentioned Israel Finkelstein. I haven't read deeply about this topic in a while. I mean, I have frankly not read deeply beyond like Israel Finkelstein and maybe some of his critics. There's all sorts of arguments about the historicity of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the 5 books, the Pentateuch. So, for the listener out there, and, for those who are not like super familiar with the chronology of the Bible, but, there are certain Bibles like Ezra and Nehemiah, during like say the Persian period, where those are basically taking place in history that we can easily comprehend. The kings mentioned, they're, the Persian kings and whatnot. Obviously the Assyrians, we have, you talk about this extensively. The Assyrians have a history during this period. Egyptians have a history during this period. They show up in the Bible. So that means, the extreme argument that the Bible was basically the older stuff was concocted somehow. Okay, I don't think anyone really ever believed this, but I'm giving an extreme representation of the extreme point that the older stuff was basically like made up sometime in the 7th or 6th century, really probably the 7th century, during say the Kingdom of Judah, and they created like these like fictional genealogies of Abraham and these great kingdom of Solomon and David and all this stuff. That seems like, from my reading of what you're writing here, that has to be wrong because there's too much circumstantial evidence of some sort of entity that we recognize as the Solomonic kingdom or, the Davidic kingdom, whatever you want to say it. And so they're obviously reworking in the Bible a real narrative, a real history. There are, like with the Dorians, and this is like particularly at this time as we're talking, this is a controversial, fraught topic to touch, but we're deep into the podcast. If you've like listened so far about what we're talking about, I think like you're not like super, you're super interested in the topic, so let's just go there. There are arguments about, okay, like if you read the Bible, you would think that the Israelites the tribes of Israel that are leaving Egypt, that they replace the indigenous Canaanite people who they exterminated in genocides, which are, written, they tabulate it. You know what I'm saying? They show the work. They show the work of how many, men, women, children, sheep, whatever that they kill in there. And then, like, if I'm reading your book or if I read some archaeology, it doesn't quite seem like that. Obviously, there's war stuff going on. That's always happening. But it seems actually to me, I know you're not like a biblical historian, but I mean, this topic like more than 99.99% of people, but it seems like, okay, the Israelites, these tribes, like, I mean, they are a branch. I mean, Hebrew is apparently closely related to the Canaanite language. It seems like they kind of evolved organically somehow, culturally, out of the substrate. And you mentioned this in the book, but, in the Bible, there's Hiram. I think he's the king. Is it Sidon that he's the king of? Phoenician king.
Right.
Yeah. And so, Tyre. Okay, so Tyre, so it's Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. I mean, I had a 1 out of 3 chance, because I knew it was going to be one of those 3 cities. So these are, modern day Lebanon, northern Israel, but really Lebanon, coastal area. And he collaborates with Solomon in the Bible, building these ships to Tarshish and all. I mean, it's like, okay, like these are basically almost the same people, is what I'm thinking. So it's not, I mean, yes, maybe they think that they're different. Like, oh, like you worship this one sky god and you call him El, and we worship him and we call him Baal, and we sacrifice children and you sacrifice sheep, whatever. You know what I'm saying? They think it's a big deal, and it kind of is a big deal. On the other hand, it's not like Urartians collaborating with Egyptians. Like, they could probably understand each other. They probably come out of the same cultural substrate. They're both like have a long time relationship with their former imperial master Egypt, which is still interfering. That's the stage that I'm setting for that part of the book. Let's talk a little bit about Israel. I know we've been going along, but like, okay, guys, there's a lot in the book. Okay, like we're skipping over a lot. There's a lot of narrative, but jump into that, Eric.
Sure. And again, you've raised a lot of the topics, but these are all things that I do talk about in the book. You're quite right. And indeed, I start right in chapter 1, because when I'm talking about Egypt, it is inextricably linked or intertwined with what's going on in Canaan and its aftermath, because we immediately get not just the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, but also the Edomites and the Ammonites and the Moabites and all the other ites that come up during the Iron Age. And indeed, this is where we do get the biblical stories. So I try to extract the history that we've got from these particular periods. And to go back to something that you said, back in the second millennium, when you're talking about things like the patriarchs, and then all the way down to the Exodus, this is all matters of much scholarly controversy. When did it happen? Did it happen? How many people did it involve? And all of that. And I do talk about the Exodus in this book also, where I present the various arguments as to what happened, but with the idea of answering the question of when do the Israelites actually come into this land, and, as you said, what then happens to the Canaanites who had been there. And on the one hand, we now are in what I would call a much more historical period, because we do have the Neo-Assyrians around at this time, and they keep very good records. They never lose the art of writing, and they've got basically the royal records, and they interact with the kings of Israel and Judah all the time, such that we not only have the stories in the Bible, but we've got them on the extra biblical inscriptions that the outside the Bible inscriptions that the Assyrians leave us, where they mention people like Omri and Ahab and Jehu. So we can now say definitively, even if we don't know much more about them, that these people that are mentioned in the Bible were real people and that they did exist, right? Which is not something we can say for sure about the patriarchs 1,000 years earlier, but we're in a historical period here. As an archaeologist and ancient historian, I tell my students that I want 3 independent sets of data before I will absolutely believe something, right? Call me a skeptic. But in this particular case, we've got biblical mentions of Hiram of Tyre or Omri, Ahab, Jehu. We've got extra biblical inscriptions, and we've got archaeology. And so for the most part, those are that's good enough for me. So we're now, again, as I say, in a historical period, but that doesn't mean that we've solved everything. And for me, this is the fun part. This is the fascinating part of trying to solve each of these mini mysteries within the larger question. So, for instance, in this particular case, we've got, did Hiram of Tyre actually exist, and did he help Solomon? And by the way, did Solomon actually exist? Archaeologically, we don't have any evidence that Solomon existed. I know that's hard to believe, but until 1992, we didn't have any evidence that David existed. And then the Tel Dan inscription mentions Beit David, the house of David. So now we know that David probably existed, and de facto Solomon should, because they're related. But again, we're still in this never land of did they, didn't they? But in this particular case, we're getting closer and closer to knowing things. But for example, let's take the Canaanites just for an instance. Did the Israelites, when they come in, and again, there's a question of when did they come in? And you mentioned Israel Finkelstein, who says that the Israelites were probably always there, but up in the highlands, and then they came down when the Egyptians left, and the Canaanite cities were overwhelmed by whatever, the Sea People's Disease and all of that. So, how long were the Israelites there? When did the Exodus take place? All of that, that's all discussed. But what happened to the Canaanites that were there? You've got two very different stories within the Hebrew Bible, the book of Judges and the book of Joshua. One says that there was a genocide and they just obliterated the Canaanites when they came in. And the other says, no, they live side by side. They basically assimilated them. So, which is the truth? Well, we don't know the answer just yet. There's all kinds of theories. And also things like now the newest is arguing that the Edomites, who are over in modern-day Jordan, they take over the copper mines after the Egyptians left. And there's an argument that they may have always been there, but they were nomadic. And it's very hard to trace nomads in archaeology, but then they settled down. So, do we have something like that with the Israelites, that they were there but nomadic and then they settled down? But in terms of the Canaanites then, and to go back to my categories of resilient versus not resilient and IPCC definitions, I've actually ranked the Canaanites in the southern Levant, what we would today call Israel, Gaza, Sinai. I've said that they're at the bottom. They're in my lowest category. They are not resilient. They either vanish or were assimilated. And this is exactly where I think a lot of discussion among my colleagues is going to take place, because I think the southern Canaanites were not resilient because they are assimilated and they become part of the society of the Israelites and the Edomites and the Ammonites and the Moabites. But, nobody talks about a Canaanite culture per se in the Iron Age. They talk about these other kingdoms. So I think that means they're not resilient. But others could argue, no, that means they're extremely resilient and they have transformed and they have become a substrata now of these other populations. So, for the I would say the general public, it's neither here nor there, my rankings, but this is where I think my colleagues are going to get rather animated and discuss things. But again, from our modern point of view, I think some of the lessons that we can learn from this, again, what do you do if things go south? What do you do if the world as you know it kind of collapses? And what do you do? Do you assimilate? Do you become resilient? Do you transform? What do you do? So the Israelites, same sort of thing. if the Israelites are already there, but kind of invisible at the end of the Late Bronze Age, does that mean that they have transformed in the Iron Age and they're extremely resilient? Or do they come in and they're a brand new culture that has come in because of the collapse? Where do they fit? And so that's where it's going to get interesting. I also think there are other parallels, and just to touch on one of your other points before I shut up for the moment, the Neo-Assyrians, I think there are a lot of parallels to today and what just happened in that region of Syria and Iraq and such, because the Assyrians and the Babylonians in Mesopotamia on the Tigris and Euphrates are among the most resilient. I actually have them in my category number 2, that they did very well. And even though we have this lack of records at the beginning of the period, we know that society for the Assyrians doesn't change that much. We do call them the New Assyrians now, the Neo-Assyrians, but they still have their king, they still have the society, they still have their laws, they still have their writing, they still have their gods and goddesses, right? Everything is pretty much still the same, and they come out of this fairly well. I mean, fairly well. There is a period of drought and famine there too, in which they resort to cannibalism. We know this because the records tell us. But then they come back, and by, let's say, the 9th century, the Neo-Assyrians are busy conquering the entire ancient Near East, including running into and attacking and conquering the kingdoms of Israel and of Judah. One by one, the Neo-Assyrians take over. And what they do there is vicious, for lack of a better word. They are bloodthirsty. They are amazing in terms of the viciousness that the Assyrians show. If we can believe their inscriptions, and it may have been propaganda to a certain extent, but they talk about capturing cities when they're fighting the Aramaeans or fighting the Urartians or other people, in which they stack up the heads of the people they've killed. They use teenagers for target practice. They do, the descriptions that they make where the rivers are running red with blood and you couldn't see the ground because of the bodies of the people they killed. As I was writing this, I just kept thinking, this is ISIS. This is ISIS, but, 3,000 years ago. And I just kept thinking, in some ways, nothing has changed. So, but I didn't see many people making the analogy when ISIS was running rampant and comparing them to the Neo-Assyrians. And indeed, I think I may have managed to avoid making that comparison in my book, but it's definitely there. So I also come back to, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Like Mark Twain said, history might not repeat, but it does rhyme. And I definitely see parallels from back then to today, which is why I think that there are lessons to be learned, not just for the Bronze Age collapse, but the sequel. What do you do after your society has collapsed?
All right. Okay, I'm going to say here at this point, those of you in the reviews who complain that I talk too much, notice there that I let Eric go for a while because it was interesting and it was informative. Okay, so I'm not saying that other guests are not interesting and informative. I do have to say, this is meta commentary, whatever, but I do have to say, Eric, I can tell you've done a lot of podcasts, listened to you on a bunch of them before. Basically, do you know who Lee Berger is? South African archaeologist?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Lee's like the kind of guy you could just let him go. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like you could just nominally jump in and be, I'm not sure if you're quite at the Lee Berger territory, but you've done enough communication where I feel like, man, let Eric Cline do his thing, right? Let Eric be Eric. So
Okay.
I haven't jumped in partly because of that. But it's interesting. There's a lot of questions, I feel like, in that section because we started with Egypt and Palestine. I think people will have a lot of food for thought and a lot of more questions. Although I think, as you said, I am now, I think I already knew some of the archaeology. So yeah, Solomon and David, something like that did exist. The Canaanites, I think the stylized fact was even from like 50 years ago is, this was a little bit of a period of not necessarily golden age, but a period where smaller civilizations, smaller societies could flourish as the bigger empires of Egypt, Assyria, obviously Hittites disappeared. Kind of were not putting pressure on them so they could let them flourish. So, like the most extreme cases of the most extreme rendering of the Solomonic temple, and you see this in some of the ersatz Israel like propaganda of some of the like right-wing Israeli Jews, is it goes from the Euphrates in the north in Syria all the way south towards the Negev, right? Now, probably that I would suspect that didn't really happen, but it could be there was a period where the Israelite kingdom, where in Palestine, in that area, whatever it was called at that time, maybe had suzerainty or like hegemony over that whole period. That might be what's being remembered, even if they didn't have direct rule. I don't know, but there's a lot of opportunities for smaller states, for smaller polities, to really kind of flex their muscles here. I do want to say, we're talking about the Iron Age and, how Dark Age isn't warranted. You're talking about, Egypt and Syria and obviously the Canaanites here. They did fine. They're not like Greece. Another thing I want to say is other end of Eurasia, because we're talking about exogenous shocks and climate change. Climates can be different in different parts of the world, obviously. And so around like 1046 BC, is when it goes from the Shang dynasty to the Zhao dynasty, which was a big cultural shift. But the earlier part of the Zhao dynasty, like Zhou, sorry, excuse me, like I gotta pronounce it correctly. The Zhou dynasty, the earlier part from like 1000 to about 800 BC is kind of its golden age, kind of like the period of classical Chinese cultural formation, even if it wasn't state formation. So at the other end of Eurasia, the whole idea of there being like a dark age, and like they did bronze a little bit longer, I think, so they were still kind of continuing the Bronze Age. But I want to bring that up because like let's look at like from a broader planetary perspective. We are focusing on the Near East partly because that's where your core competency is, and like that's where the records are. That's what cultural relevance for people in the West. We're talking about the Bible now. But there's a whole world out there. We don't know what's going on. We kind of know what's going on in China because there are records or cultural memory in China really starts obviously with the oracle bones. The Shang people were Chinese as we would understand them. They're people, Hua people, but really the Zhou dynasty around 1000 BC. That's what Confucius is pointing to as kind of the peak of rule by sage kings and whatnot. So while all this is collapsing, Egypt is kind of being held, going low, because the sea peoples. China is actually coming into its own. So there's a balance to that, I want to say. We've been talking for a while, and I want to be respectful of your time, as they say in the biz. So let's just, because you already talked about Assyria and Mesopotamia, which I was actually super interested in, and you talked about Elam. Those are all interesting topics. There's a lot of we alluded to the Neo-Hittites, so let's like not dig deep on that. What I want to dig deep on, last major topic, alphabet. Again, like bronze to iron, it seems less of a eureka moment and more of some sort of transition. It seems like the general narrative that I have read most recently that probably came from the city-states of Syria, moved to what we would call Phoenicia, and there's a whole section of the Phoenicians in there. And then the Phoenicians transmitted it to the Greeks. Greeks probably transmitted it to the Etruscans, who transmitted it to the Romans, and those are the letters that I'm probably seeing. Something like that is correct. And I also want to emphasize the alphabet. Obviously eventually the Persians adopted alphabet, in the Near East, Iranians, and that went into India, became the basis for Brahmi, which is all of the, the syllabic, all of the scripts, that are in like India in the Indian subcontinent, those also go back genealogically to this. Actually, I think that the old Mongolian script also does, because it goes from the Uyghurs, who probably got it from the Indians. And so, the whole genealogy goes back to the Near East 3,500 years ago. So as we close out, with again, there are a lot of topics in here. Obviously, recommend the book, but we can't go on for like 12 hours. So let's talk about alphabets. Let's talk about literacy. Greeks coming back to literacy. Their original form of literacy was Linear B, which they basically did accounting, sacrifice 3 men to Athena, so that whatever, we will be able to enslave the neighboring citadel, whatever. And have make this many woolen jackets out of the sheep. And then we have things like the Iliad, the Hesiod. I mean, these are originally oral poems, but these are really what's written down later. It's a whole different world. It's a whole different landscape. Talk about that. End of literacy, quote, Dark Age, really Iron Age, small scale societies, and then the readaptation of literacy around 800 BC, and the chronology on that, which there's a little bit of revisionism that I see in your book. And can you flesh that out for the listener?
Okay, so just a couple small questions to end this, right? Yeah, we'll be here for another 12 hours. Yeah. Great. Well, all good questions, and to kind of take them in order too, I would agree. Bringing in China and all of that would have been fascinating, and I leave that to somebody else who can do a world history. What I'm concerned with in this book is looking at the globalized network that collapsed at the end of the late Bronze Age, and then how long it took that network of connections, trade, diplomacy to get rebuilt. And it takes about 400 years to the early 8th century. So I don't have China and other areas in there because they're not part of that connected network. But it would be extremely valuable, yes, to do something even bigger, broader, that would take a look at what's happening elsewhere in the world at that time. But to come back to the question of literacy and alphabets and such, this is actually a very good example where different societies are affected in different ways by the collapse. Some lose literacy completely and some do not. So you've just mentioned the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, who were using, at that point, Linear B at the end of the late Bronze Age for accounting this many chariot wheels, this much bronze, these many slaves, that kind of thing. Well, they lose that. Linear B stops being used by 1050 at the absolute latest, 1050 BC. And the question would be why, and I think it's as simple as the palatial structure went down, and Linear B was used in the palaces for the accounting. And so either all the scribes have been killed or have moved away, or just as likely, there's no need for them as an occupation anymore because you don't have the kings. As you mentioned, we've got all the big empires or kingdoms moving out, and the smaller ones taken over. In fact, some of my colleagues say that the smaller kingdoms now in the Iron Age flourish because they're out from under the shadow of the bigger empires, and that may be actually the normal way of things with these smaller kingdoms. But though the Mycenaeans may have stopped and lost the art of writing, as I've mentioned, the Assyrians did not lose it. As you've mentioned, the Egyptians did not lose the art of writing. They still know how to do it. And indeed, what we've got with the alphabet is not a brand new invention, which most people think, ooh, we have the invention of the alphabet. No, we have the standardization of the alphabet. We've got the alphabet. Some have argued that the first attempts at an alphabet in the Near East go back to the 18th century BC. We know that Ugarit in the late Bronze Age, there are at least 2 versions of the alphabet that they are experimenting with. So when we get down to the period of the Phoenicians, they are simply standardizing the alphabet, but then they spread it. And that's the beauty of it. They not only standardize it, but they then spread it. And as you mentioned, it goes over to Greece. It eventually makes its way over to Italy and becomes both the Greek alphabet and the Latin alphabet. And of course, we still use the Latin alphabet today in English, French, German, Italian. The Romance languages all use the so-called Latin alphabet. And even things like Cyrillic come down from it. So the Phoenicians are the ones that spread it. And what's interesting, these Phoenicians, again, as you mentioned, they are in what is today modern Lebanon. They are what I call the central Canaanites, right, as opposed to the southern Canaanites or the northern Canaanites. Central Canaanites are living in Lebanon, as we call it today. They are survivors of the Bronze Age. They are transforming. In fact, the Phoenicians are in my top category. They are as good as it gets. They are not just resilient. They are not just transforming. They are anti-fragile, again, as Nassim Nicholas Taleb has talked about. They flourish in this age of chaos. In fact, the Phoenicians take over from Ugarit. Ugarit, to a certain extent, had monopolized the sea lanes in the Bronze Age towards the end. I mean, yes, you've got Egyptians, you've got Mycenaeans, you've got Canaanites, but Ugarit, in what is now coastal North Syria, they really were out on the seas. But Ugarit is completely destroyed. And in fact, that was one of the things that prompted me to write the revision of 1177 BC, are these new tablets that were just published, finally. They were found quite some time ago, but they were just published in French in 2016, where it talks about invaders overrunning the port city of Ugarit and advancing on the city of Ugarit itself. Unfortunately, they don't say who the enemy is. They just say the enemy. But we know archaeologically that there's a meter of destruction at Ugarit, 3 feet deep of ash. There are arrowheads embedded in the walls, and Ugarit is abandoned for up to 600 years after that. So who steps into the power vacuum? The Canaanites in the central region, that is, the Phoenicians. They have survived the collapse, and they are taking advantage of this power vacuum. And as one of my colleagues says, the Mediterranean became a Phoenician lake. And so the Phoenicians are sailing hither and thither. They're not only spreading the alphabet, they're also bringing purple dye to everyone, right? It becomes royal purple. And they eventually found colonies everywhere, including Carthage, right, in North Africa, which eventually will take on the Romans in the Punic Wars. So the Phoenicians, along with the Cypriots, are in my top category of being the most resilient to come out of this. They take advantage, right? And some have said that if you take a look, for example, just to introduce another topic at this late date, there are people that talk about an adaptive cycle in civilizations, that the rise and fall of civilizations is a traditional process. It's what is to be expected. And that after a collapse, you have not necessarily a dark age, but an age of invention and innovation. And that's actually what we've got here, right? And the Cypriots with iron and the Phoenicians with the alphabet, they are inventive, they are innovative, and it takes off in a whole new aspect, a whole new part of the adaptive cycle, right? And so that's where I think, again, this holds lessons for us. And at the end of the book, I put in some kind of common sense societal lessons that we can learn from the collapse and the aftermath. And they're things, like I say, they're common sense, like have multiple contingency plans in place and redundant systems to fall back on if your primary things fail. You should be resilient enough to withstand whatever blows come, but strong enough to resist enemy attacks if you can. I also think you should be as self-sufficient as possible, but do have friends that you can call upon when you need their assistance. And again, appropriate to today, you should prepare for extreme weather conditions, because if they come, you'll be ready. And if they don't come, it won't matter. Right. So, and then above all, and I think this is where we're heading in the near future, you need to have dependable water resources. You need water. Of the major Bronze Age civilizations that had the greatest impact, Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Hittites, Assyrians and Babylonians both have the Tigris and Euphrates, and the Egyptians have the Nile. Only the Hittites don't have a huge water source. They had the Halys River, but it wasn't much. And the Hittites are the only ones that collapse. So I think keeping an eye on our water resources is going to be very important going forward for us, just as it was back then. So at the end of the book, I try to make this relevant to today. And in fact, I think it's the very last paragraph where I'm comparing the Mycenaeans, who are down at the bottom of my list in terms of being resilient, and the Phoenicians as being at the top. I actually straight out ask, so are we Mycenaeans or are we Phoenicians? How are we going to do? But then I say, you know what? We're going to have to leave it to future historians and archaeologists to weigh in on how we did and whether we succeeded in overcoming the obstacles that we see around us today.
Yeah. So, what you say, I think, actually, about how innovation came out of this chaos at the end of, what you, I think I'm going to put a link because I've alluded to this. First of all, I got to say, Eric, you really love what you're doing. When you were on Patrick Wyman's podcast about the late Bronze Age, it was like a kid in a candy store. And I'm like, bro, wait, hasn't this guy been studying this for decades? And you're still, you know what I'm saying? You still got that. First of all, so infectious. I think everyone hears it, and to live your life. I'm sure, this is what people would dream of, doing what they would probably do for free, which I think you would. You can tell it's in your voice. So talking about the end of the old, kind of the global civilization of the period of the Eastern Mediterranean, it unleashed new forces, new cultural forces, also unleashed innovation. So, we know from modern economic historical work that actually economic downturns is often when the next, what we would call unicorns today, is founded, right? So, for example, Facebook, it was founded a little bit before the Great Recession, but really its peak period, when the Social Network, that movie, its cultural relevance was right during and after the Great Recession. And so it's not that shocking that this down cycle, because it is a down cycle in terms of you just got to look at aggregate population. I think it's the easiest way to, we're Malthusian, culture before the modern period and the demographic transition. So there's a down cycle, but these smaller states can come out kind of from under the shadows of the bigger empires. Now, Walter Scheidel, who you probably know, historian, he's written books about Rome and stuff like that, compared Rome to China. One of his arguments is the West, its innovation comes out of its decentralization, whereas China, as successful as it was, centralized everything, and that dampened innovation. And so listening to you talk, I think one takeaway is actually the end of the old equilibrium was good, actually, over the long term. In the short term, for the people, for the kings, for the men and women being sacrificed to the gods and all these things, for the sea peoples and for the Egyptians, it was not the best of times, But out of this came the Age of Iron. Out of this came the alphabet. You can imagine a situation where in these palace complex societies in Greece, you got this literate people, they handle all the writing, they handle all the accounting, and everyone else does their thing. We can analogize it maybe to a mainframe style civilization where, there's a big computer in the big office building, and there's 6 computers in town, and they crunch a bunch of numbers, they print out the dates, and They print out like the water bill and all these other things. And then you have kind of a revolution in affairs, and there's decentralization, and everyone's got like a desktop, and they're doing desktop publishing and whatnot. And so I think that that's an analogy we can use of what happened with the spread of literacy, where there was a certain, and let's get real, a lot of people don't like reading and writing. So if you don't have to, why? So sometimes people just don't see the need for things until they have it in front of them. And another analogy I'll use is, when the original Xerox PARC team in the 70s got the idea of Windows and point and click, they actually surveyed focus groups, and the focus groups all said they preferred key commands, but they wanted to like test them. And once people did windowing with a point and click, they refused to go back to key commands. So sometimes people don't know what they want, what they need, what they can use until they're forced to use it. Obviously, despite the flourishing of, say, the Central Canaanites, what we call the Phoenicians, overall, this was a period of economic contraction and scarcity in a lot of ways for elites, and they had to retrench. And so what retrenchment does is it forces efficiency, forces innovation. You got to upgrade your computer software. You got to upgrade your hardware. Like capital investments all of a sudden are what give you the edge on the competition. And so I think the way you can think about it is there were capital investments after the collapse of the old order, where to survive and continue, you had to adapt. The Neo-Hittites adapted. The old Hittites did not adapt. Greeks are kind of in the middle. I do have to say, and we've been going over long, so I don't want to Cyprus pretty much seems to have like kind of evolved or transformed, as the Peter Browns of the world would say. But it's also on an island. So again, geography and geographic determinism, I think, matter a lot. Honestly, like I didn't feel like you emphasize that a lot, but I'm just like noticing you're on an island and it's pretty far away, and also Cyprus is not a flat island. There are mountains. I mean, this is like optimal for maintaining fortifications, strongholds. I think there's some evidence of people on some of these islands moving from the coast up into the mountains so that they can, probably withstand raids. But, these sorts of geographic things are important. So I think what you're alluding, as we're closing out, we're alluding to exogenous shock, climate change. There's geographic structural parameters, but then you have like the underlying human protean evolving element of culture, so that, so the end of the hieroglyph civilization or the cuneiform civilizations at the end of the Bronze Age gave rise to something different. What is that something different? We have like the alphabetic civilizations, which obviously it's a more flexible system. You don't need to be a specialist. Obviously there are scribes that exist, but scribes exist to copy. They don't exist to write as such. There's arguments about the penetration of literacy in the ancient world, but it probably was, I don't know, closer to 10% than 1%. Let's put it that way. And that's not a trivial number. There was a time where 10% of Americans had a desktop computer, but it already transformed our culture and our civilization in many ways. And 10% of people were on the internet and so forth, right? So I just want to emphasize there that this is a cultural revolution, as well as obviously what you see in the material remains. And so as I was starting to read the book, you're an archaeologist by training, I thought it was going to be more of a material story. There is material in there, but it's also quite clearly a cultural story. There's a narrative story. So it's more fully fleshed out because you have more resources to draw upon. And that was great. So last question, and then we'll close it out. I know that some listeners want more. Some people are sick of this, whatever. You'll both have to deal with the end of this conversation. I asked you this the last time. What are you working on? What you were working on was this book. Okay, obviously you just got the book out, done. You're basking in the glory of your greatness, of finishing. For you personally, finishing, right, is, I know how it is. I think a lot of people know how it is. Finishing these big projects, you exhale, you breathe a sigh of relief, but you're looking at the horizon now. So what's going on?
Good question. So a couple things. One, I should mention actually that the same day that the sequel comes out, we're also publishing a graphic version of the original book, which has been drawn by the marvelous Glynis Fawkes. And you mentioned people today that don't necessarily like to read. So 1177 BC is going to be coming out in basically a comic book form, but it's huge. It's really thick, gorgeous, beautiful pictures. Glynis is a wonderful cartoonist as well as an archaeologist. So I'm very excited. And that'll be out at the same time as the sequel. But in terms of future projects, I've got a bunch of irons in the fire. But one of the things I am toying with, and this is contingent upon desire on the part of the general public, I'm thinking of actually making this now into a trilogy and having a third book and have it pick up where this ends and begin in the year 776 BC, which is the year of the first Olympics, and going for the next 400 years, which is, the so-called axial age, and it covers classical Athens and the democracy and all of that. So if there is enough of a demand, I'd actually write a third volume in this series, which I never had any intention of doing that. I mean, it was just 1177 and then the sequel. Well, maybe there's a sequel to the sequel. And the more I look at it, the more I feel as if my narrative is unfinished, because in ending this book where I do in the early 8th century, I haven't even touched on Homer. I haven't even touched on Hesiod. I haven't had the Neo-Assyrians destroy the kingdom of Israel. The Neo-Babylonians haven't destroyed the kingdom of Judah. I haven't gotten to the Babylonian exile, haven't gotten to democracy in Greece. So I really, a large part of me thinks the story needs to continue being told, but it will depend on on how this book does and on whether there's an interest. So I think that's the way I'm headed, is the third book.
Yeah, I gotta say, I didn't know what you were going to say when I asked that question, but finishing the book, it does feel a little bit like a cliffhanger, because you've like basically set the stage for the great liftoff of the axial age, and then you're like, fini.
Right.
Like, okay.
Right.
Which I get, because you're a Bronze Age guy, so I was like, okay, I got it, But I definitely was just like, okay, I see the foundations of what is to come, but what is to come is left unsaid, which I can see. I can see you continuing that. I'm gonna say, I'm gonna leave you now, but I'm gonna say, like, Eric, don't pull a Martin. We don't want to turn into memes of like when 2042 Eric Cline is gonna I don't know, come out with the next book. Like, I'm gonna be I'm like, I hope my daughter doesn't have like a kid by then. You know what I'm trying to say? It's like, so let's although I think if you do write 776, I think that's gonna be, like, not gonna lie, that's gonna be an easy book for you to write. I think
it'll be fun.
I mean, the material you got to work with, like, you're swimming in it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's like, it's basically like, kind of framing it. I'm already imagining. All right, I'm gonna let you go. I hope the listeners really enjoyed this conversation. Obviously they hear the passion in your voice. I hope they hear the passion in my voice. Like the 8-year-old in me kind of comes out. I was super interested in the Bronze Age at that age. In alternate universe, maybe I do follow my historical passions more than my scientific passions, but they're all still there. And I love reading your stuff. I love listening to your podcasts. Keep communicating and putting it out there. We live in an age of miracles in terms of what science can do, what we can know, and we need to appreciate it. These are the finer things in life, to know ourselves, to know where we're from. And then also, you allude to it, and I don't want to get too much into it because that's a little bit off topic, but where are we going? There is news you can use in this book, with climate change, anthropogenic climate change, the environment. And I don't think people should read history to plan for the future, but it doesn't hurt, So with that, I will let you go, Dr. Cline, and thank you for coming on the podcast and, 4 years from now, let's talk about 776.
Sounds good.
All right.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you, and thank you to the listeners for sticking with us. But thank you.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure they're still here, man. This is good. I'm sure this is gonna be big. They're gonna love it. Okay. If you have a sibling with autism, your future child's risk for an autism diagnosis is increased by a factor of 2 to 3.5. Orchid's whole genome embryo reports can help mitigate your child's risk by screening for over 200 genetic variants, definitively linked to autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. Discuss your situation with a genetics expert.
This podcast for kids